We're glad that you will get a moment in your Saturday to join us. So we are in Advent together. We have made a commitment for the 31 days of December leading into the next decade to put our hearts together and take about 5 minutes a day to just orient our minds toward what the season's really about and how we can apply it to our lives, which I think is going to actually really, I don't know about you, it's really going to help me to think well going into January, because I feel like we're getting this nourishment for our soul each and every day, just in these little bits. So we have done a series on the 7 habits of Jesus. We're now in the characters of Christmas and the choices that they made. And we're looking at a choice that each of them has made as we've moved through. So we started with Mary and we talked about choosing belief. We talked about, actually, belief was Zechariah. So Mary, and then choosing faith, choosing hope. Sorry, Mary was choosing hope. Zechariah was choosing belief, and Elizabeth was choosing to receive, and just the joy of what happened in Elizabeth's life. You can listen back on those if you want. They're on Instagram TV, they're here on Facebook in a series, or on my YouTube channel. And today we are continuing that series on the characters of Christmas, talking about Joseph. And we are talking about the choice to obey. So if you don't know about the Gospels, where you're going to find the Christmas story is going to be either in the book of Matthew or the book of Luke. Interestingly enough, the book of Mark, which is a book of action, starts just in Jesus's public ministry. And in the book of John, we actually have the start of the book of John at the creation of the world, where Jesus was with his Father before he came to earth. So only Matthew and Luke kind of give us this backstory on Jesus's birth. And particularly the book of Matthew was designed for readers who were Jewish, who understood the Jewish scriptures and the Jewish system. And Matthew really articulates all of the prophecies of Christ that are revealed all through his life, his birth and his life. And that's where we also find the story of Joseph. So we're going to cobble together some different little pieces. And we sometimes have to make our best guess about the timeline of exactly how things went. Did Joseph have a dream from Gabriel before or after he knew about Mary? We know it was after. But when did he know about Mary's pregnancy? We don't know some of those. So we're going to do the best we can with what we have. So here's the deal with Joseph. He was betrothed to be married to Mary. Now, betrothal is a little bit different than what we understand as engagement in our culture. Betrothal really was a formal agreement that were usually made between parents about their children coming together. And it was a legal agreement before the marriage. So it was almost as if it was a marriage on paper first before it was a marriage in a physical expression or in actually living together. So in that time, that would mean that perhaps young teenagers, decisions would have been made about their future, about bringing these families together. And that would be actually a formal and legally binding agreement that would require a divorce in order for that to not be the case. And that's kind of the relationship that Mary and Joseph were in. We don't know how old they were. We can only sort of hazard a guess based on what we know about the culture at the time. But we do know that they were in a legally binding betrothal, which was basically as good as married, except not living together, not living out the intimacies of marriage together, but bound together to be together. So that was what their betrothal was. And we know that Joseph and Mary were betrothed when the angel Gabriel visited Mary and told her that she'd be having a child, a miraculous conception of Jesus outside of marriage and outside of a sexual relationship. So that's what we know about Mary. Now, what was that like for Joseph? Let's talk about that. Because when Joseph discovers that Mary is pregnant, it says in scripture that he had in mind to divorce her quietly so as to not bring shame upon her. The actual legal steps that he could have taken were stoning to death. Like, to be an adulterer, to find someone pregnant outside of marriage, outside of her betrothal, the actual penalty, should Joseph have wanted to enact it, would have been a trial of Mary and potentially a stoning, death by stoning. Now, we don't know how often that happened. We do know later in the Gospels, there is that moment when Jesus in his ministry interrupts a woman caught in adultery who is being convicted, and that all is going on. So let's consider that real. But Joseph wants to make the honorable choice. And for him, the honorable choice is that he can take away her shame by not by just divorcing her. And so that's kind of like the good choice. But actually, Joseph is called to an even higher choice, an even higher level of obedience. We already see that Joseph is the kind of man who is taking not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. And so he was interpreting the spirit of the law, that he had a choice, that he could divorce her quietly and not bring upon that shame to her. And then the angel Gabriel visits Joseph. And he tells Joseph about Mary and about who Mary is, and that he wants that Joseph should take Mary as his wife, that it is truly a miracle, that this is the Son of God. And then Joseph has a choice to make, which is an even higher choice than the choice to be righteous. Because now what is upon him is that he is going to take shame upon himself. So at the time when he said he could divorce her quietly, he was taking away her shame for her actions. But when he takes her in to his life, now the shame is also upon him. And what's amazing to me about this, I feel like Joseph doesn't get like enough cred in this story, is that what Joseph does there to me is so reminiscent of what Jesus does in his ministry. We know it says in scripture that Jesus, for the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame. And I feel like actually Joseph scorns the shame of his time when he just takes Mary on. Now we know that Gabriel came to him, but he still had a choice to make. Sometimes I think we read these stories like it's a fairy tale, like it's not a human being who had the choices that were upon them. And the interesting thing about all of these interactions as they happen, when these human beings are making the choices that they're making, have you noticed they're all one-to-one experiences? So Zechariah has an angel visit him in the Holy of Holies. He's completely alone. No one else can see it. No one else experiences it. Mary has Gabriel visit her alone. No one else can see it. No one can experience it. Joseph has Gabriel visit him in a dream. No one else can see it. No one else can experience it. They are having these personal faith experiences where they have a choice to make about the life they're going to live. Now, I love that we call this Advent together, because the togetherness comes after the choice, that they're able to understand each other's faith and be called to that higher place, just like when Elizabeth and Mary came together. I mean, this is why I believe that God has truly called us as a church to meet together, to be together, because in being together, our faith is encouraged. But our faith is first and foremost a personal experience in the inner places of our heart. And Joseph had that choice to make, and he chose obedience. He didn't just choose the good thing, he chose the best thing, because the best thing was what he was called to be obedient to. And that meant the humility and the humiliation of taking on a scandalous relationship that, as we know, followed them for their life together. As you sort of get these rumors, as you read through the Gospels, of what people really thought about Joseph, about Jesus, about Mary, as best we can understand it, and how scandalous, it's still scandalous today. Like, it's scandalous today. It was certainly scandalous then. And so Joseph makes this choice to take Mary on as his wife, even without that relationship, and in the midst of this shame. So what can we learn about that? The first thing that I think is that obedience always takes courage. It always takes courage to live a life that is different, called to something higher than what the herd is doing. It always takes courage. I think that's why our faith requires courage, and Jesus gives us courage to live that out. But if you're going to be serious about following Jesus, there are going to be times in your life where you are called to a level of obedience that feels like more than you can handle. It's not just the good thing. Like Joseph was willing to do the good, righteous thing, but he was called to the extraordinary thing. And the way I think about this is when you ask yourself, what's the good thing to do right now versus what's the best thing I could do right now? And we're not always going to make the best choice, but I do think that we have that in front of us, which is based on the spirit of who Jesus is and how we follow him into heart integrity, word integrity, love, generosity. What's the best thing that I can do right here? Because I think a lot of us are good at the good thing, but the best thing usually takes on this higher level of commitment and of courage from each of us. I think the way of Jesus is always the way of humility. Joseph had to take power that he had. He had power in that system. As a man, a Jewish man, he had power. He had the power to bring Mary to trial. He had the power to convict her of this sin. He had the power to divorce her quietly. But he actually took his power and he used it, brought shame on himself. He used it for the good of not only Mary, but of course, of the whole world, of the history of the world, in a way that I'm sure Joseph and Mary could not understand at all in the time time that they were making it. That's the other thing. If we think that faith is always makes sense, it doesn't. Faith does not always make sense when we're doing it. Obedience often comes when we experience a choice that God is asking us to make that we know in our own mind we do not want to make. But when we actually step into it, we feel peace. You may not feel happy. You may not feel like it's the best choice for you, but when you are obedient to what God has called you to, what you can experience is a settled peace. I would even go as far to say sometimes it actually feels like a resigned peace. Like you just sort of have to resign to what God's calling you to do, even without it feeling great, because a lot of faith is about taking a step that only makes sense 20 steps down the road. It's about taking the step that's in front of you. And I think Joseph is this incredible model of what it means to not just choose the good thing, but to choose the best thing. Joseph scorned shame. What would it look like for you to use your power, to use what God has given you, to lay that down on behalf of others? That often means moving toward people that we don't want to move towards. It means laying down our own story to allow space for something else. It means serving with humility when we don't want to serve. And I do think that that's what we have a choice to make. There is joy on the other side of that choice, even if the joy doesn't come right when the decision is made, if that makes sense. So listen this weekend, and as you go into this time with your family members into Christmas, there is such a desire, I think, to live out of our own expectations and our own sort of what this image would look like of what these next few days mean. But what would it be like to ask yourself, what's the good choice to make for this person, whatever this interaction I'm having, and what would be the best choice that I could make? All right, you guys, I'm going to have a little spiritual exercise for you tomorrow, and then we will continue with the characters of Christmas on Monday. See you then. Thanks for coming. All right, bye, you guys. If you